Welcome back. More Grail units and more stuff added to the meta. And it's been only 1 month and the game's still as crazy as, maybe worse, who knows? There's just so many more things that need to be accounted for, and yeah, that's always fun. I wanted to update this list earlier, but given that we were getting a bunch of Grail units and a bunch more additions, I wanted to hold off a bit until we finally got Soren in. And now that he's in, I adjusted the definitive Grail tier list accordingly. And I wanted to go over all of the changes in just some roundabout thoughts and then some final recommendations for anyone looking to build any sort of unit. So that's what we're going to do today. Before we hop right into it though, I do at least want to bring mention of how I do the scoring. It's basically going to be a roundabout way of like a golf rules sort of thing where you get points tallied based on how high or how low you are on a tier list. So if you're super high on the tier list, you get less points. If you're lower, you get more points. And this will be across an Aether tier list, an Arena tier list, and a Summoner Duels tier list. And at the end of it, the unit that has the least amount of points will essentially quote unquote win. And really that's all it boils down to. So just keep that in mind as we go into it. Anyway, we might as well go into the meatier topic first in the Aether segment, as it's only been 1 month, and we have a lot more changes because, well, they introduced a lot more skills and they introduced Emblem, which means there's a lot more to consider nowadays, especially on light season. And this is where a bit of the complications come in, because you could argue that a unit works really, really well on Astra, and it doesn't really work on light, and then vice versa. For now, I'm of the belief that if you really are going to stand out, you have the flexibility to work on either season. And because of that, there's going to be a lot of notable changes, mainly in the armors, but also in the likes of Walhart and Nacella, who benefit greatly nowadays from not only a Gale Force role, but also a Dark Defense setting. So because of Emblem's Severance, which basically just nullifies any sort of savior effect, which is more than likely always going to happen because, well, the range is pretty damn big. Now it means that units that weren't normally able to function on Aether's defense setting because of saviors are going to be functioning a lot better as a result, which includes the likes of Walharts. And because saves are basically nullified on Dark Season and Light Season, it means that enemy phase strategies are going to be a lot more volatile, especially since it's the same season where you can run stuff like Catria Balls, as there's no false start on that season. And because of this, a lot of Gale Force roles are also going to be skyrocketing, which is why you're going to also see a lot of weird promotions. So in terms of when it comes to the top tier role, in my opinion, these four rocket really well. I did go over Eldigan and Richter previously, but to summarize, Eldigan dodges Milla, which is a pretty big deal, meaning that he's more than likely always going to have dance going no matter what. And Richter with his refund is just absurdly good in all sorts of facets, whether that's for just general tanking or just Gale Force properties or anything of the sort, because it has dual phase speed based breath, slaying 10 attack and speed, and damage reduction, meaning that he's just going to be a pain in the butt to take down in general. But now because of Severance, I'm now in firm belief that Walhart and Nacella go up a tier. Walhart because now he can inflict his flash effect with a lot more consistency, and it's going to be a really big pain in the ass if you want to try an enemy phase, especially if there is a Walhart, because now you can't use near saves to get around it. And because Light Season is definitely taking a drastic turn towards player phase strategies, I find that Nacella, especially with the addition of Beast Near Trace, and his own refund having the innate Flashing Blade effect with half no follow-up, means that he's going to be a prime Gale Force user in general, which is really, really good. I guess the only caveat could be just using his Sacred Seal for quick impulse, but you could always get around that through other means. Still, I find that when it comes to the top tier, these four are going to be performing really, really well on that front. And to go more into that, because I do think player phase strategies are going to be the way to go for the most part when it comes to light season, I think that units that have the Arcane Downfall, which is basically a Slaying Axe with unconditional breath, stats, and healing, is going to be really, really good for hidden run properties, or even just trying to do a Wings of Mercy thing. The Wings of Mercy beaconing is going to be a bit harder because it does heal per hit, but if you can get knocked out of the range, which could be easy to do because units just hit absurdly hard, it may not be too bad, especially if you are looking to initiate combat on the first turn, which is also really easy to do now because we have the Odd Tempest Seal, which any infantry and flyer can get, which is really great. Other notable inclusions include Kemph, who also follows a similar structure to Walhart, although he does require a combat to set up, and in my opinion, Walhart just having it out of the gate is just going to be a lot better comparatively. And as I keep emphasizing with Emblem, armors are just going to be suffering a lot more unless they're on a defense setting, and I do think Zephyr can still function pretty well in a defense setting, but otherwise it's going to be a big uphill battle, which is why I don't think most armors, or relatively any armors, are really going to be scoring as high comparatively, and that could just be me being really harsh, but considering Emblem is more than likely going to be a mainstay for a long time, I find that sometimes you just have to be drastic in some scenarios. Another interesting thing I did want to point out is the addition of Special Spiral 4, which has damage reduction piercing, and while this doesn't necessarily make Young Innis inadequate or just obsolete at this point, I do think it's not nearly as compelling of a niche, especially since any unit can just use it and can target it for res, which is really big when you consider that a lot more units have less res than defense. So in that regard, you could give it to someone like Knas with Special Spiral 4, Times Pulse, and keep in mind he also has the Quick Impulse effect in his weapon for the first 3 turns. He can basically do the same thing as Young Innis, albeit Young Innis can run tempo, which is really good. Regardless, I don't think it's nearly as compelling nowadays, which is why I do think he goes down a bit. And I'll go into the newer editions soon enough, but for right now, Hans and Yarn are pretty good additions. Hans can still do the same arcane downfall stuff, but I do think his weapon alone can actually function really well, especially on the Gale Force setting. And Yarn is also just a prime Gale Forcer, especially now that we have Beast Agility, and he has a Quick Impulse 2 effect after combat if his HP is below 90%, which is going to be extremely easy to accomplish. Other notable changes include more Special Spiral 4 stuff, Arcanes, and Magical Lantern, Gale Force strategies increasing in favor, and again, Emblem just nullifying the Savior effect, meaning that a lot of armors are just going to be suffering as a result. So you can even see units like Arden and Black Knight falling in viability as a result, and again, this doesn't necessarily make them bad, but I do think it is a big detriment to the Savior archetype in general, which is why I don't think I am as comfortable putting them in any higher tier. But again, also with Special Spiral 4, you could also put any generic unit like Alfric. He has a stupid high attack stat. You give him the Arcane Special Spiral 4, and he's going to be doing a lot of damage, especially if you were to put him on a Catria Ball. And the same thing can be used for Magical Lantern users, which is the new weapon that we got from the Desert Sword, which is effectively just a breath tome with attack and res, which is really strong, especially on infantry where they can run stuff like Times Pulse or even a 2 cooldown special. They don't even need the slang. And if you were really worried about guard effects, you can still run a 2 cooldown special and trigger on the second hit, which is going to be really good, especially against Saviors. But I mean, we already discussed why Saviors may not necessarily be as potent, but it could always still play a role, especially on an Aether offense setting. And again, more general changes with Gale Force. I do also have Death Knight up here, because he also just recently got a refine. And it's not necessarily the best. It does have Spectrum 8 slaying, a guaranteed follow-up, and follow-up denial, which is still pretty good on its own. But I think for 2023 standards, it's not really the greatest. Although I do believe that despite it also just being immediately shut down by any sort of no follow-up, if you were to use it on any sort of turn 1 Gale Force, it can actually work out in your favor. So as far as the rest of the adjustments go, it's really going to boil down to Embla, Arcanes, and Wyvern Katana. Now I'll go into those in a second. But for now, you also have Bruno and Soren. Soren, again, you're going to basically follow the same thing of a Catria Ball with Special Spiral, and he can hit really hard with the Breath effect. And then with Bruno, he's still going to be your typical far save armor, but as with all the other far saves and just armors in general, they're going to be suffering a lot with Severance. Either way, if you do want to run any of the new Grail units, you absolutely can, whether that's Hans on a Gale Force set, which I don't think he's ever really going to struggle with a Heavy Blade check, because I'm pretty sure he has the highest attack in the game, and if it's still not, it's definitely up there, which still leads me to believe that even though Heavy Blade checks are extremely difficult, he's not really going to struggle on that front. Although, if you are looking to double anyway, you can try Flashing Blade, but he has a guaranteed follow-up anyway. Regardless, it could work fine. Bruno, you could still run as a far save. You stack up his attack and speed, so he can at least try and run something with Savvy Fighter. and otherwise just hope and pray he doesn't get hit by a Deadeye or anything like Special Spiral 4. And then the other two I did basically talk about. Yarn, you just want to set up Gale Force. He doesn't even need Heavy Blade, which is really convenient because he does get the Quick Impulse 2 effect after combat, and as long as he's not going up against any unit with Guard, and he survives the combat, he's going to Gale Force, which is really good. And then Soren, you just put him on a Catria Ball and he'll do work. He may not have the best stat line, he may not necessarily be a great unit on his own, but I do think he could do a good amount of work because of the fact that he has Magical Lantern and a really, really high attack and res stat, which can also be used to check stuff like Ninja Camilla, you know, but also he's blue, so it's a good coverage regardless. And back to those three things I mentioned earlier, it's not really going to be too much explanation because I already talked to death about Emblem, but as for Arcane, it's basically just a really good guaranteed follow-up slaying Red Tome, which means even stuff like Leon is going to get pushed down because, well, his weapon is just completely outdated as a result, and Wyvern Katana basically taking away a lot of those niches from a particular amount of units that don't necessarily have more effects other than just the dual phase Brave effect. So units like Arden and Finn and Har and etc. are going to be retroactively affected as a result, and especially when it goes into the Summoner Duels tier list, which I'll go into in a second. And as far as the Aether Raids tier list is concerned, that's really about it. So with that, we can move on to the Summoner Duels list, which is going to be a bit less daunting because there's going to be a bit less changes for the most part. Emblem and stuff like Legendary Veronica can still be a really big pain, but not only are maps going to vary week by week, but also the captain skills, so it's really, really hard to evaluate whether or not armors are going to be drastically affected as a result. I personally don't think they're going to be as affected in Summoner Duels as they are going to be in Aether Raids because you're always static on that one parallel map as opposed to Summoner Duels where everything just changes all the time. And there's no guarantee you're ever going to really run into anything like that. Regardless, there are changes that can still be made, such as Wyvern Katana just saturating the Brave niche. So units like Arden, who are still really, really good on their own, are not nearly as unique and can still be competed with the likes of maybe someone that is a lot more min-max, or somebody that just has an overall better stat line, even if it comes at the cost of a bit of attack. At the end of the day, a good amount of armors are just really there to tank, and generally for matchups that also have Miracle tacked into it, there's a good chance it's not really going to matter at the end of the day because Arden also just has horrible matchups against Brave Seliph, and he's probably one of the most common threats you're ever going to run into. Other than that, you just have other arcane adjustments, whether that's with Downfall, with stuff like Godlike Reflexes and all that stuff, and the No Follow-Up Seal, or Arcane Eclipse, where you could also do the same thing as you would with like Year 2 Ophelia, or just spam really hard-hitting specials with Special Spiral 4. And again, similar to the likes of Arden, I find that Finn also having his own dual-phase Brave niche without anything that necessarily allows him to stand out comparatively, even though the weapon is still pretty decent. I find that the differentiations are still not going to necessarily be enough. And then as for Death Knight, who got a refine, and then the new Grail units, well, you can sort of basically do the same thing in Summoner Duels, although it's going to be a lot more volatile comparatively because you can have instant no follow-up ready to go. But assuming that the foe doesn't have no follow-up, which I don't necessarily think is going to be practical most of the time, but regardless, there's stuff you can do with it. His weapon alongside Near Trace can still allow him to double when needed, and run away and set up stuff like Defense Risk Smoke, so he can also act as a Pathfinder unit. And you may not necessarily be the best, but I think for what it's worth, it's not necessarily the worst either, especially since you're still getting Spectrum 8 from his weapon, and he can actually become a really big stat ball. As for the 4 new additions, I find that some of them are going to be suffering a lot more than others. Hans, I would argue that you're better off just replacing his weapon with the likes of Arcane Downfall and then giving him something like Godlike Reflexes and Shield Pulse, so he can act as a much more suitable ranged tank, or tank in general, because his weapon doesn't have innate slaying. It does have damage reduction in it, but I don't find that it's necessarily going to be as coveted as something like Godlike Reflexes, especially since Godlike Reflexes cannot be pierced by stuff like Special Spiral 4 or Deadeye. Meanwhile, Bruno is absolutely never going to work as a far safe because too many things can just ruin his day, and that's also part of the reason why I switched Hans' weapon for Arcane Downfall. I personally think you're better off making him as a near save unit because there's less threats that are going to pierce through damage reduction. And while this still is like really not the best, I find that you're better off just doing this over a far safe because I don't necessarily think you're going to find as much success otherwise. But also, Brave Seliph being pretty much everywhere too. The green color is not helping him at all. As for New Year Yarn and Desert Soren, New Year Yarn, you're basically sort of doing the same thing, except you could set up stuff like Speed Smoke 4. The only caveat, in my opinion, is that he doesn't have a guaranteed follow-up in his weapon comparatively to his OG self, so he still has to run stuff like Beast Agility or run some sort of external support if he wants to have some sort of ability to double anyway. So with that in mind, I don't think he's going to be necessarily as strong, especially since you are losing out on stuff like Trace, although you can still do stuff like Fallen Ninian or Desert Lanes and give everyone a follow-up and then you're fine there. But that still takes up a slot comparatively. And Desert Soren, he's pretty generic. You're still going to be doing the same thing as you were on a Dark Defense, but again, there's just so many better options that have a lot more bigger threat ranges, which is why I don't think he's necessarily going to be as good on Summoner Duels. But again, you can still make it work. And then finally, we have the Arena list, which is going to be pretty basic for the most part because it just fully requires BST. And I don't think this one's going to take a lot of highlighting. It's really just, oh, which modern unit has the best BST and has the best ability to score. And spoilers, it's going to be Hans, because he has a PRF and Infantry BST. As it currently stands, he's one of the highest scoring Grail units in the game, alongside Holst and Cervantes, which is really beneficial if you're looking for something that can be used in pretty much any mode. Meanwhile, you have Bruno, who actually does have a fair amount of BST. However, he is held back by the fact that he is a ranged armor with no PRF to call his own, meaning that he still scores the same as a lot of other generics, which is fine, but if you are looking to just specialize in something like scoring, it's not really going to take you that far, especially since we have so many means of inflating score nowadays. And then as for New Year Yarn and Desert Soren, New Year Yarn does have a PRF, but he doesn't have as much BST as Bruno does, which does mean they end up pretty much scoring the same for the most part, which is completely fine. I should note that I don't necessarily think that if one unit necessarily competes better in Arena than another, then they should be higher, because at the end of the day, it's just any unit with high BST. So you can bring someone like Ray, if they scored 200 BST, but still performed as their Gen 1 self. I'd still put him in the highest tier, if that was the case. And then for Soren, he unfortunately falls in the same line as a lot of the other generic infantries. He doesn't have a PRF to call his own, meaning that he's pretty much capped at 180 BST, which means he's not necessarily going to be the best when it comes to scoring, but you can still use it for stuff like tier 19, tier 20, especially if it's going to be for something a bit more casual. But regardless, he isn't necessarily the best scoring unit, and I don't think there's ever going to be a chance where he gets a PRF, ever, because as it currently stands, they don't do seasonal refines for units that don't have PRFs and they've been skipping around, and if they're going to go back and do it, they have so many Gen 1s and Gen 2s and Gen 3s to go through. So being a Book 7 unit with no PRF is going to be a bit disheartening. Still, that's really about it when it comes to the 3 tier lists, and overall, I do think there's a lot of merit to pretty much a lot of units in general from the Grail pool. However, if you are looking to get the most bang for your buck, I do think that there are 4 units that just currently stand out right now, and that's Hans, Reeve, Rutger, and Walhart. Rutger and Reeve aren't necessarily new additions to this because they were ranked accordingly on the last video. However, the newer addition being Hans and Walhart getting a massive boost thanks to Emblem does actually solidify their positioning in the most valuable Grail category, in my opinion. And if you did want to get, again, the most bang for your buck, these 4 would be really, really good. But just keep in mind that anything can change at any moment. And if you aren't really too concerned about necessarily just anything, then you're better off just building what you want at the end of the day. But I do think it's worth considering if you don't really necessarily have a big direction to go in. And really, that's going to be about it for the Grail video. I am probably going to come back next month when we get the new Grail units and new inheritables and all that stuff, because there's a good chance a lot of it's also going to change again. But you'll have to let me know what you think down below. Do you think I'm being a bit too harsh on some placements, a bit too lenient on others? Do you think there are some units that should be higher or lower? Let me know down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.